Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. The Arizona sun had no mercy that afternoon. The heat pressed down like a hand that never lifted, and the air shimmered above the red dust as if the whole desert were trembling. Ayoka moved through it slowly, her steps uneven, her breath sharp and shallow. The skin on her face was cracked, and her bare arms carried the faded marks of long days beneath the sun. Her deerskin dress was torn, the seams frayed from travel. Each step left a faint print in the sand that the wind immediately began to erase. She had been walking for days with no food left, only a small water pouch that had run dry yesterday. Once, she would have known where to find roots or which cactus could be cut open to drink. But now her mind was fogged from exhaustion. She wasn't walking to survive anymore. She was walking to stop. Ayoka was once the daughter of a respected Apache leader, known for her healing hands and her quiet strength. But the tribe she called family had been scattered after a skirmish near Fort Sutter. Settlers blamed her for the death of a white woman, a charge she never understood, let alone confessed to. By the time she realized what was happening, her people had turned from her, fearful of retribution. They left her behind. The last sound she heard that night was the hoofbeats of her own kin disappearing into the dark. Now she stood at the rim of Redwater Canyon, a deep, rust-colored wound in the earth that stretched wide into silence. The wind rushed up from below, dry and hollow, carrying nothing but dust. She looked down at it, her mind empty of fear. Her hands trembled, not from hesitation, but from weakness. There was no anger left, no reason left to fight. Death wasn't something she wished for. It was just the only thing that made sense after everything else had stopped making sense. She took a step closer to the edge. Her knees nearly gave out. Then, behind her, a voice broke through the wind. "You don't want the buzzards to have you, miss." It wasn't a shout. It was quiet, low, and calm, almost ordinary. Ayoka froze, her breath catching her chest. She turned her head slightly and saw him standing several paces away, half shadowed by the slope of a rock. He looked like a man carved out of the desert itself. Weathered face, rough jawline, clothes coated in dust. His wide-brimmed hat shaded his eyes, but she could feel his gaze, steady, not judging. His rifle hung loosely at his side, not raised. Elias Ward had been riding the canyon's edge that morning, checking the line where his small herd sometimes wandered. A former Confederate soldier, he long since stopped caring about the causes of men or the lines they drew in the dirt. He'd fought enough battles to know that none of them left a man whole. After the war, he worked as a gunsmith in Prescott until a fire took his shop and his family with it. Since then, he lived alone in a broken cabin near the canyon rim, surviving through habit more than hope. When he first spotted the small figure climbing the rock ledge, he thought it was an animal. Then he realized it was a woman, thin, staggering, barefoot, walking toward the edge. Something in him shifted. He didn't call out right away. He just watched, the way one does when trying to decide whether to intervene or let the world take its course. But when she moved closer to the cliff, instinct overrode everything else. Now, standing there, he studied her face. She looked half-starved, half-dead already. He saw the dirt under her nails, the scars along her arms, the cracked lips. And yet there was something in her eyes that wasn't quite gone. Ayoka didn't answer him. She looked back, toward the canyon, as if considering whether the interruption mattered. "You hear me?" he said, his voice still steady. "Ain't no good way to go down there. Buzzards will strip you clean before the fall dust settles." Her throat felt dry. The words took a moment to reach her. Not just their meaning, but the tone. He wasn't mocking her or giving orders. It was almost like he cared whether she lived. She hadn't heard that in a long time. Her legs wobbled. For the first time that day, she felt something she didn't expect, embarrassment. She didn't want to die while someone was watching. Elias took one careful step closer. "You look about done in," he said. "There's water not far from here. You can drink, rest a while. Then, if you still want to jump, you'll have a clearer mind for it." It was a strange offer, blunt but honest. Ayoka stared at him, trying to decide whether it was a trick. Her pulse hammered in her neck. The wind carried fine grains of red dust between them. Finally, she stepped back from the edge. Just one step. Elias nodded slightly. That's better. He turned and began walking, not checking whether she followed. Something about that, his refusal to beg or command, made her move. Her body ached, her thoughts scrambled, but her feet began to follow his tracks in the sand. As they walked toward the horizon, the canyon's rim behind them fell silent again. Only their footprints marked that something had changed there, faint signs of two people who had no reason to keep going, but did anyway. They walked in silence for nearly an hour. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction. Dry brush, low hills, the occasional saguaro standing like a sentinel. The wind had settled into a steady, hollow hum. Ayoka's steps dragged, but she didn't fall behind. Elias led at a pace that matched her condition, not once looking back. She noticed that, how he neither hurried her nor offered pity. Just movement, just purpose. When a faint outline of a cabin appeared through the haze, she thought at first it was a mirage. The small structure leaned against a line of old pines. One corner caved in. Beside it stood a corral with a single horse, a gray mare with dust on her flanks. A thin line of smoke rose from a small stone chimney. Elias opened the door without a word and motioned for her to enter. Inside, the air was cooler, dim, and heavy with the smell of wood smoke and metal oil. A table stood crooked near the center, covered with a few tools and a broken revolver. Shelves along the wall held tins of coffee, gun parts, and a few old books. Against the far wall sat a bed. Not large, just a cot covered in worn blankets. Sit, he said simply, nodding toward a chair. She obeyed, her legs trembling. When she tried to speak, her voice cracked. Why help me? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured water from a tin jug into a cup and handed it to her. You looked thirsty, he said. She drank greedily, the coolness hitting her stomach like shock. When she finished, she set the cup down carefully, as if afraid she might break it. Her hands were still shaking. Elias crouched by the fire pit and added a piece of wood. The flames flared softly, pushing back the dimness. He spoke without turning. I don't take kindly to folks dying near my place. Makes the nights worse than they already are. His tone wasn't cruel. It was matter of fact, the kind of honesty that didn't invite thanks. Ayoka looked around the cabin. It was clear no one else lived here. A pair of worn boots by the door, a rifle leaning against the wall, a single plate on the shelf. She noticed the small details, the care he took in keeping the tools organized, the patched curtain over the window, the small wooden cross on a shelf, half burned from age. You live alone, she said quietly. Been that way a while, he replied. He took a piece of bread from a tin and placed it in front of her, along with a small piece of dried meat. She hesitated before eating, her instincts telling her to mistrust strangers, but hunger outweighed pride. He watched her without comment, just observing. After a while, she asked, You from around here? He leaned back against the table. Not anymore. I used to be from back east. Virginia. Fought in a war that made no sense when it was over. Came here looking for quiet. Found too much of it. She looked at him closely then. The lines on his face, the scars on his knuckles, the way he avoided looking directly at her for too long. He wasn't a cruel man, but there was heaviness in him, something he carried like a weight that never left. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, rattling the loose boards of the cabin. Elias stood and checked the window shutters, securing them. He moved with the precision of habit, a man who lived by routine because routine kept him sane. Where were you heading? He asked suddenly, his voice low. She hesitated. There was no point in lying. Nowhere, she said. There is no place left for me. He looked at her a long moment, his expression unreadable. There's always someplace left, he said finally. Maybe not where you want to be, but somewhere. The words stayed with her. She didn't know if they were meant for comfort or just something he said to fill the air, but they mattered. When night came, Elias gave her his blanket and took the chair by the door. She lay down on the cot, too tired to argue. The sound of the wind outside and the slow creak of the cabin boards filled the silence. In the dark, her mind wandered back to the faces she'd lost. Her father, her younger brother, the old women who had taught her the songs of healing. She remembered the accusations, the fear in her people's eyes when the white soldiers came, the moment she realized she was alone. The shame of being unwanted clung to her still. Across the room, Elias sat in the dim firelight, his eyes half closed but not asleep. He could hear her breathing, shallow but steady. She was a stranger, maybe even dangerous, but there was something familiar in her quiet, the same emptiness he'd lived with for years. He thought about the war, about the men he'd buried, about the fire that had taken his wife and son. He'd stopped counting how many years had passed since then. Helping this woman hadn't been a choice. It was something he did before he could think, like his body decided before his mind caught up. In that silence, both found a strange sense of stillness. Not comfort, not yet, but something close. Outside, the desert night cooled. The wind softened, brushing the pines with a faint whisper. Inside, the fire crackled, a small reminder that life still moved, even in places forgotten by the world. Ayoka closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she felt safe enough to sleep. Elias watched the fire until it burned low, his thoughts heavy but quieter than usual. Neither spoke another word that night. Yet in that silence, something unspoken had already begun. The slow rebuilding of two lives that had nothing left but the will to stay alive. Morning came slow, the way it always did in the desert. No rush of light, just a gradual brightening that turned the horizon from gray to pale gold. The smell of smoke still lingered in the cabin. Elias was already up, standing by the stove, frying something in a small iron pan. Ayoka stirred awake, her eyes blinking against the thin light that crept through the cracks in the shutters. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then she saw him and tensed, the instinct to flee rising before reason caught up. He noticed. "You're safe here," he said, not turning around. His voice was calm, the same as yesterday, low, steady, without weight or expectation. She sat up slowly, feeling the stiffness in her arms and legs. Her body ached from days of walking and nights without rest. She looked around, more clearly now, seeing how everything in the cabin was used but cared for. The tools were clean, the rifle well-oiled, the floor swept even if the boards were uneven. He lived like a man who needed order to keep his thoughts from falling apart. Elias placed a tin plate on the table, a small piece of bacon, hard bread, and coffee that smelled stronger than it should. "Eat," he said simply. "It ain't much, but it'll hold you." She nodded once and began eating quietly. The food tasted like ash and salt, but she didn't stop. Hunger was still stronger than taste. He poured her another cup of coffee, and for a moment they sat across from each other in silence. The only sound the faint crackle from the fire and the wind brushing the cabin walls. When she finished, Elias leaned back in his chair. "You plan on staying long?" Ayoka hesitated. The truth was, she hadn't planned anything. "I don't know," she said. "You want me gone?" He shook his head slightly. "No, just asking. You look like you need a few days." That simple answer surprised her. She'd expected suspicion or warning. Instead, his tone carried something unfamiliar, a kind of quiet understanding. Later that morning, she followed him outside. The sun was already climbing high, lighting up the canyon rim in sharp, dry colors: red, brown, pale yellow. He moved with deliberate rhythm, feeding the horse, stacking firewood, checking the water barrels. She watched how everything he did had a purpose. "You don't talk much," she said after a while. He glanced at her. "Talking never fixed much for me." She gave a small nod, understanding that too well. She wanted to ask more. How long he'd been alone, what had happened to him. But something about his posture told her not to. There was a stillness in him that felt fragile, like if she asked the wrong thing, it might crack open something he'd spent years holding shut. Instead, she offered to help. At first, he refused. Then, seeing her determination, he handed her a small axe. "Stack what's already chopped," he said. "Don't go cutting. You're too weak for that yet." Ayoka worked slowly, her movements uneven at first but steadying as the hours passed. Sweat rolled down her neck, mixing with dust. The physical strain made her feel alive again in a strange way, pain that meant purpose. Elias watched her from time to time, saying nothing, but he noticed how her hands didn't shake anymore and how she carried herself with quiet focus. By evening, when the shadows grew long, they both sat outside the cabin, sharing the same silence that had become their unspoken language. The horizon burned with soft light. Elias finally spoke. "You from one of the southern tribes?" She nodded. "Apache. San Carlos band." "I figured." He paused. "That's a long way from here." "I had to leave," she said simply. "Because of the soldiers?" Her jaw tightened. "Because of my own people. They said I brought trouble. A woman was killed near the trading post. They said I cursed her. The whites wanted someone to pay, and the tribe didn't want another war. So they gave them me." Elias didn't flinch. "You run." "I survived." He looked at her a long moment. The honesty in her voice, flat, tired, without self-pity, told him everything. He'd met enough liars in his life to know truth when he heard it. He turned his gaze back toward the canyon. "World's full of folks running from something they didn't do," he said. "Doesn't make you less worth saving." She glanced at him then, really looked at him. The deep creases at the corners of his eyes, the faint gray in his beard, the way he avoided looking directly at her when he said something kind. She realized he was a man who'd been broken long before she arrived, maybe even longer than he'd admit. That night, as the desert cooled and the crickets began their slow rhythm, they ate by the fire. She repaired a torn section of her dress using a small needle from his kit, while he cleaned his revolver with steady, practiced motions. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt earned. Before sleeping, Ayoka asked softly, "Why did you stop me that day?" He didn't answer right away. He finished reassembling the gun, set it aside, and looked at her. "Because I've buried enough people. Didn't want to add one more to the count." She nodded. No more words were needed. When the fire dimmed and both settled into the rhythm of breathing and silence, there was a strange peace in the small cabin, fragile but real. The world outside still held its dangers, but inside those walls, for the first time in a long while, neither felt completely alone. In the faint glow of the dying embers, Elias glanced toward her once more before closing his eyes. For a man who believed life had already ended years ago, he felt a faint, almost forgotten thing stir within him. Not hope exactly, but the start of something close. And Ayoka, lying awake a little longer, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this quiet place wasn't just a stop on her way to death, but the beginning of her way back to living. The next morning began quietly. The sky was pale and colorless at first, then slowly turned gold as the sun rose over the rim of the canyon. Ayoka stepped outside the cabin before Elias woke. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of juniper and dust. She breathed it in deeply, her body sore but steadier than the day before. The canyon stretched before her, endless, dry, and silent. She studied it not as a place to die this time, but as a piece of the world that was still there. Inside, Elias stirred. His movements were unhurried, each task performed with the steady rhythm of someone who had lived alone too long. He cooked breakfast, checked his rifle, and fed the horse. Everything about him was deliberate, never wasted motion, never small talk. Ayoka began to notice his habits. The way he touched the brim of his hat before leaving the cabin, the quiet pause he took each time he looked toward the east, where the old trail ran toward Prescott. She could sense that his silence wasn't coldness. It was something closer to discipline, a way of keeping the past under control. That morning, after they ate, she helped him patch a section of the roof that had started to sag. He handed her the nails and guided her where to hold the board. For a long time, the only sounds were the hammer's dull thuds and the wind brushing against the cabin. When they finished, Elias leaned against the wall, wiping sweat from his brow. "You work hard," he said quietly. "I worked all my life," she replied. "Work keeps the mind quiet." He nodded in agreement. "That's true enough." She hesitated for a moment before asking the question that had lingered in her thoughts since the first night. "You said you've buried enough people. Who were they?" He didn't look at her at first. His hands tightened slightly around the hammer. Then he exhaled. "My wife and boy. Fire took the shop back in Prescott. I was out that night. By the time I got back, there wasn't much left to find. Ayoka said nothing. She just stood beside him listening. Elias continued, his tone flat but quiet. I was a gunsmith. Sold rifles, repaired what the army brought in. After the war, folks still wanted tools for killing. I kept making them, even when I told myself I wouldn't. Maybe I was paying for it, one day at a time. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. He wasn't asking for pity. He was explaining himself, not to her, but to the empty air that had listened to him for years. She finally spoke. You think the fire was punishment? He shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe it was just bad luck. Either way, it made me stop asking why. Ayoka looked down at the dust under her feet. She understood that feeling too well. When the world takes something from you so violently that you stop trying to reason with it. You're still here, she said softly. So are you, he replied. Their eyes met for a moment. It wasn't comfort, exactly, but it was a quiet recognition. Two people who had stopped believing in purpose but somehow ended up alive anyway. As the day wore on, Elias saddled his horse and told her he'd be gone for a few hours to check the southern trail for coyotes. Ayoka offered to go, but he shook his head. You stay here. If anyone rides close, go inside and keep the door shut. She didn't argue. The memory of the deputy's mention of a runaway Apache still hung heavy in her mind. She knew she was wanted, though she didn't know for what crime exactly. Rumors had a way of spreading faster than truth out here. While he was gone, she walked the edge of the canyon. The wind had changed direction, cooler now. She found a flat stone near the rim and sat there, staring out into the distance. Thoughts of her father returned. His deep voice when he spoke to the tribe, his firm belief that strength was found in patience, not violence. He'd taught her the old ways of medicine, of mending bones and curing fever. But she hadn't saved him when sickness came. The tribe had buried him at dawn, and she'd felt her place among them die that same day. The sound of hooves pulled her back. Elias returned at dusk, dust covering his clothes, a small cut on his forearm. She hurried to take the reins from him. What happened? Coyote trap, snapped wrong. I'll live. He moved inside, sitting at the table while she fetched clean water and cloth. Without asking, she cleaned the wound. The skin was raw, and he flinched only once. She wrapped the bandage tight, her hands steady and practiced. You done this before? He asked. Too many times, she replied. He looked at her, curious. Healer? Yes. My mother taught me. He nodded, thoughtful. That explains the way you handled that knife last night. Careful, not afraid of blood. She smiled faintly. Blood never scared me. People did. For the first time, he gave a short, quiet laugh, brief but real. Can't argue with that. That night, a storm moved over the desert, dry thunder, the kind that never brought rain. The cabin creaked under the shifting wind. They sat by the fire again, both half-shadowed by the light. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. You could go north if you wanted, he said after a while. No one would know who you are. She shook her head. They'd find me. The deputy who came before, he was looking for someone like me. He studied her face, trying to read what lay beneath her calm. You kill anyone? No, she said simply. But they think I did. A white woman died near the post. They said I used witchcraft. The army wanted to make an example, and the tribe wanted peace. I ran. Her voice didn't tremble. There was no plea for sympathy, just truth. Elias took it in quietly, his jaw tightening. You can stay here a while, he said finally. Ain't nobody comes this far out unless they're lost or stupid. Her eyes softened. Which one are you? He smiled faintly, the first real smile she'd seen on him. Little of both, I reckon. The storm passed slowly, leaving only the faint echo of thunder. As the fire burned low, Ayoka looked toward the door, half expecting the sound of approaching horses, but there was only the quiet hum of wind through the pines. She felt the same unease every night, the fear that the world would remember her and come knocking. But tonight, that fear seemed farther away. Elias leaned back in his chair, eyes on the fire. You don't owe me nothing, he said softly. If you leave tomorrow, that's your choice. But if you stay, you pull your weight, same as me. I can do that, she said. I know, he replied. For a long while, they sat there, two shadows flickering against the wall. A soldier who had seen too much and a woman who had lost everything. The wind outside began to settle. Neither said it aloud, but something had changed between them. What began as survival had started to turn into something steadier. Not trust yet, but the beginning of it. The kind that comes from shared silence, from seeing the worst in another person and not turning away. And as the fire dimmed, Ayoka realized something she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. The morning broke with a sharp chill, the kind that made even the dust feel alive. Elias was outside cutting wood, the steady rhythm of his axe echoing through the canyon rim. Ayoka knelt near the small fire pit, grinding herbs she had found in the hills the day before. She had begun rebuilding her old habits, drying leaves, mixing salves, sorting them into small pouches made from torn scraps of cloth. She didn't call it healing anymore. It was just something that kept her hands from shaking when the memories came back. The cabin had grown quiet in a different way lately. It wasn't the uneasy silence of strangers anymore. It was the kind that forms between two people who have found a rhythm without ever speaking about it. Elias had come to expect the smell of herbs in the mornings. She had come to expect the sound of his boots at the door by sundown. But that morning, the sound that broke their peace wasn't his axe. It was hooves. Elias froze mid-swing. The horse was close, heavy, steady steps coming from the southern trail. He set the axe down, his body instinctively shifting into an old stance, the one soldiers used before battle. He turned to Ayoka, his eyes narrowing. "Get inside," he said quietly. She didn't ask why. She could hear it too. He moved toward the porch, wiping his hands on his trousers, his mind already preparing for what could follow. When the rider came into view, Elias recognized him immediately. Deputy Collins, a lawman from the Prescott line. His gray coat was coated with dust, and the badge on his chest caught a faint glint of light. "Morning, Ward," the deputy called out, pulling on the reins. His horse snorted, tired from the ride. Elias nodded once. "Collins, you're far from town." "Yeah, I could say the same for you." Collins scanned the yard, his eyes sharp. "Heard there's been sightings out here. An Apache woman traveling alone. You seen anyone?" Elias kept his face calm, his voice steady. "Ain't seen much of anyone in weeks. Coyotes, maybe. Few vultures." Collins dismounted, brushing the dust from his coat. "They say she's dangerous. Killed a trader's wife near Fort Sutter. Some of the army boys think she's hiding with someone." Elias's jaw tightened. "I live alone. You know that." "Yeah, but you've got a reputation for keeping to yourself. Makes a man wonder what else you're keeping." Collins's eyes drifted toward the cabin door. Inside, Ayoka stood completely still, her back pressed against the wall. The sound of the men's voices carried through the thin boards. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she remembered Elias's words. "You stay put. You move only if I tell you." Outside, Elias took a step closer to the deputy, keeping his tone controlled. "You came all the way out here on a rumor? Don't you have better things to chase?" Collins shrugged. "Rumors got legs when it's tied to a dead woman. The army wants her found, and the county wants it quiet. Figures she can't get far without help." "She can't get far at all in this desert," Elias said. "Maybe not, but you always had a soft spot for the broken ones, didn't you, Ward?" Collins's voice carried a faint smirk. "After your shop burned, after you disappeared, folks said you'd lost your mind. Some said you were hiding ghosts." Elias's eyes hardened. "You rode all this way to dig up the past. Were you looking for something real?" Collins looked him over. For a moment, it seemed like he might push further. Then he sighed. "You've got a sharp tongue for a man who's got nothing left to lose. Maybe that's what keeps me alive." They stared at each other for several seconds, the wind blowing dust across their boots. Finally, Collins tugged his reins. "If you see anything, you send word to Prescott. That woman's worth a lot of trouble to the right people. Don't make it your trouble, too." Elias gave a curt nod. "Safe ride back." The deputy mounted his horse and turned toward the trail. Before riding off, he cast one last look at the cabin, his eyes lingering a moment too long. Then he rode away, leaving behind a faint trail of dust that shimmered in the light. When the sound of hooves faded, Elias waited a minute before going inside. Ayoka stood exactly where he left her. Her breathing was quick, her eyes wide but steady. "He's gone," Elias said. She swallowed hard. He knew. Maybe, Elias admitted. But he didn't see. There's a difference. She looked at him, uncertain. "If they come back." He sighed, removing his hat and setting it on the table. "Then we deal with it. But you're not leaving tonight. You're too weak for that." Her voice rose slightly. "You risked yourself for me." "Why?" Elias met her gaze. "Because I don't much care for watching people get dragged off for something they didn't do. I've seen too much of that." She wanted to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, she sat down slowly, her body trembling from the fear she'd held in. Elias poured water into a cup and slid it toward her. "Drink. You'll need your strength." Later that evening, he went outside to secure the shutters, his thoughts running tight and fast. He knew Collins wasn't done. Deputies didn't ride that far alone unless they had reason. If he'd noticed anything, a footprint, a shadow, he'd be back, and next time, not alone. Inside, Ayoka quietly cleaned the table, her hands moving automatically. Her mind kept replaying the sound of the deputy's voice, the way he said worth a lot of trouble. She knew what that meant. To men like that, she wasn't a person. She was a bounty, a story to tell in town over whiskey. When Elias returned, she was sitting by the fire, eyes fixed on the flames. He sat across from her, the air thick between them. "You still think I should stay?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, his expression calm but resolute. "If you run, they'll catch you. If you stay, I can keep them off a while longer. That's all I can promise." She studied him for a long moment. The steady eyes, the tired strength, the quiet way he said promise, as if it was a word he hadn't used in years. Finally, she nodded. "Then I'll stay." The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters like distant drums. Elias leaned forward and fed another log into the fire. The flames grew, lighting both their faces, hers marked by exhaustion, his by quiet resolve. They didn't know what would come next, but both understood something had changed. Their shared silence was no longer just survival. It was a decision, one that would bind them to each other for better or worse when the desert came calling again. The night after the deputy's visit was long and restless. The fire burned low, and every sound outside, a shifting branch, a distant coyote, made Ayoka's pulse quicken. She lay awake on the cot, her eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling, watching shadows move across the boards as the flames flickered. Elias sat near the door, rifle across his lap, half awake, half listening to the wind. Neither spoke, but both knew the same thing. The peace they had built was no longer safe. When dawn came, Elias was already outside, scanning the ridge through his old spyglass. The sky was still gray, the canyon below swallowed in mist. He stayed there for a long while, unmoving, until he was sure there were no riders on the horizon. Ayoka stepped out quietly, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes followed his line of sight, searching the same emptiness. "You think he'll come back?" she asked. Elias lowered the spyglass. "If he's smart, he will. Collins isn't the type to let things rest." Ayoka nodded. Her voice was steady, but her hands were tight around the blanket. "Then what happens when he does?" Elias turned toward her, his expression calm but direct. "Then we make sure you're not easy to take." That morning, he brought out 2 old rifles and a revolver from the cabinet near his workbench. The metal was dull, the grips worn, but they were functional. Ayoka watched as he cleaned each one, the precision in his movements showing the years of habit that never left him. "You ever shoot before?" he asked. "I've seen men do it. Never tried." He handed her the revolver. "You'll learn. It's not about killing. It's about knowing what to do when someone wants you gone." She hesitated, her eyes fixed on the weapon as if it were alive. Then she took it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly under its weight. Elias stood behind her, adjusting her grip. "Keep your wrist straight. Don't fight the recoil. Let it move with you." They practiced outside, near the canyon rim. Each shot echoed across the empty land like thunder. Her aim was poor at first, the recoil jarring her arms, but Elias didn't scold or rush her. He gave short, simple instructions, and she followed them with quiet determination. By midday, she could hit a tin can at 20 paces. When she finally lowered the gun, sweat ran down her temples, and a faint smile tugged at her lips, the first real one Elias had seen. "It's louder than I thought," she said. He nodded. Everything worth doing usually is. In the days that followed, a quiet routine returned, but it was different now. Heavier, more deliberate. Elias reinforced the shutters, checked his traps farther out, and made sure there was always water and food ready. Ayoka learned how to saddle the horse, how to find the landmarks along the canyon in case she had to flee alone. He didn't say it directly, but both knew he was preparing her for a day when he might not be there to help. At night, they still shared silence by the fire, but it wasn't empty anymore. She would mend his shirt while he worked the metal of an old knife, reshaping its edge. Sometimes he'd tell her small pieces of his life. How he once made rifles for soldiers who'd never lived to fire them. How he buried his son beneath a cottonwood tree. How the desert, for all its harshness, never lied to him. One night, after a long silence, she asked softly, "Why did you really stay out here all these years?" Elias didn't look at her. "Because it's quiet," he said. Then after a pause, "And because I couldn't stand being around people who thought killing made a man honorable." She understood that. More than he knew. "You think I'll have to run again?" she asked. He studied her face in the firelight. "I think you'll have to decide when to stop running. That's not something anyone can do for you." She looked down, the words settling deep. For years, every step she'd taken had been about survival. Not choice, not direction. For the first time, she realized she wanted more than just to live. She wanted peace. The next day, she tried something different. While Elias was out checking his traps, she cleaned the cabin, every corner, every dusty shelf. She cooked what little they had, boiled water, and hung herbs near the windows to dry. When he returned, the place smelled faintly of sage and cedar. He stopped at the doorway, surprised. "Didn't expect this." She shrugged. "You said if I stay, I pull my weight." He smiled slightly. "That you did." They ate together that evening, the sound of crickets filling the space between words. When a faint wind swept through the open window, carrying the smell of rain that never came, Ayoka looked at him and said quietly, "You saved my life twice now." Elias took a sip of coffee before replying. "No, you're the one who chose to step back from that edge. I just happened to be standing nearby." She smiled faintly. "You don't take credit for much, do you?" "Don't see the point," he said. "World doesn't hand out rewards for doing the right thing." Their eyes met, hers calm, his tired but softer than before. Something unspoken passed between them, something real. Not romance, not yet, but the beginning of understanding, the kind that only forms between two people who've carried their pain long enough to recognize it in someone else. That night, the wind howled harder than usual. Elias stood by the door, looking out into the dark. "Storm's coming," he said. Ayoka joined him. "Do storms scare you?" He glanced at her, half smiling. "No, they remind me I'm still here." She looked out at the shifting shadows and said quietly, "Then I guess we both are." As thunder rolled far beyond the canyon, Elias closed the door and bolted it. The cabin walls creaked, the lanterns flickered, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside was ready to swallow them both. Yet inside, there was warmth, a fragile calm built from exhaustion, trust, and something close to belonging. When Elias finally sat by the fire, he looked at her across the small room and said, "Whatever happens, you don't owe me anything. Just stay alive." Ayoka met his gaze, her voice firm and quiet. "I'm not leaving you, Elias. Not while I still have a choice." He didn't answer, but his expression softened. The firelight caught the faintest trace of relief on his face, the kind that comes when a man who's been alone too long realizes someone finally meant what they said. Outside, the storm kept moving east, leaving behind the sharp smell of wet dust. Inside, neither slept for hours, both listening to the rain that never truly came, both knowing their uneasy peace wouldn't last forever, but that for now, it was enough. The next few days felt stretched thin, every hour drawn tight with waiting. The deputy's name hung in the air like a scent the wind wouldn't wash away. Elias went about his work with the same measured rhythm, mending the fence, cleaning the rifle, checking the traps, but Ayoka could see the difference. He looked toward the canyon more often now, listening for hooves instead of coyotes. By the fourth morning, the signs were there. A line of fresh tracks in the sand, newer than the night's wind should have allowed. Elias crouched to inspect them, his jaw tightening. 3 horses, he said quietly. They came up the southern trail. Her stomach turned cold. The deputy? Most likely. And not alone this time. He straightened slowly, brushing dust from his hands. You'll pack what you need, just in case. Inside the cabin, Ayoka moved quickly, collecting the small bundles of herbs, the knife, the water pouch. Her mind raced, but her hands stayed steady. She knew running again might mean losing everything she'd rebuilt here. The silence, the warmth, the first place that hadn't treated her like a curse. Elias loaded his rifle, checked the chamber, then handed her the revolver she practiced with. If they come close, don't aim to kill unless you must. Fire once, then move. She nodded, but he could see the conflict in her eyes. He paused at the doorway. You've got nothing to prove, Ayoka. Surviving is enough. Before she could answer, the sound reached them, distant hooves, deliberate and slow. The kind of approach that meant authority, not haste. Elias led her to the back of the cabin, near the ridge. There's a cut through the rocks. It'll take you to the riverbed. If things go bad, follow it east. She stared at him. And you? I'll buy time. No, she said firmly. If they find you helping me, they'll hang you. He gave a short, tired smile. Then I guess I'll make sure they don't find me either. The horses stopped outside. Voices carried through the wind. Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, but pointed down. Deputy Collins dismounted first, 2 riders behind him, one wearing a cavalry coat, the other a younger man with a nervous hand near his holster. Morning again, Ward, Collins said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. You didn't send word like I asked. Nothing to report, Elias replied. That's so. Collins stepped closer. Funny thing, a traveler said he saw smoke from this direction a few nights back. Thought maybe you had company. Elias didn't move. I cook my meals with fire, same as any man. Collins's gaze swept across the yard, then toward the window where the curtain hung still. Mind if we take a look inside? Elias's voice stayed calm. You got a warrant? The deputy smiled thinly. I've got a dead woman and a missing Apache. That's enough for me. The standoff lasted a full 10 seconds, long enough for the riders to shift uneasily, long enough for Ayoka to watch through the small crack in the back wall, every muscle in her body tight. Elias finally stepped aside, opening the door just enough to make it look like he had nothing to hide. Inside, Collins's eyes moved over the room. The tidy shelves, the tools, the patched roof. Nothing out of place. He turned toward Elias. You always been this neat. Gives a man less to think about, Elias said evenly. Collins studied him for another beat, then turned to the younger deputy. Check the corral. The man nodded and left. The second one walked around the cabin side. When the room was quiet again, Collins stepped closer. You know, Ward, I used to respect you. You did your time in the war, kept your head down. But now folks say you've gone soft, hiding things, helping people you shouldn't. Elias met his eyes. I'm done helping men who use the law to hunt the helpless. Collins's hand drifted toward his revolver. Careful with your words. Careful with yours, Elias said, his voice low. Outside, the young deputy shouted, Nothing here. Collins exhaled, frustrated. He looked around one last time, then holstered his weapon. You're wasting away out here, Ward. A man like you could have made something useful of himself. I did, Elias said. I stopped doing harm. Collins sneered but didn't answer. He walked out, mounted his horse, and nodded to the others. We'll keep watch east of the canyon. If she's around, she'll slip sooner or later. Elias stood there until the sound of hooves faded completely. When the last echo disappeared, he went to the back of the cabin. They're gone, he said softly. Ayoka emerged from the shadows, her hands still gripping the revolver. Her eyes glistened, not with fear this time, but with something closer to relief and guilt mixed together. You lied for me, she whispered. He nodded once. You'd have done the same. She looked at him for a long time. No one's ever done that before. He leaned the rifle against the wall, exhaustion heavy in his movements. Then maybe it's about time someone did. They stood in silence, listening to the wind move through the canyon. For the first time since the day she met him, Ayoka stepped closer, not in fear, but in gratitude. She rested her hand lightly on his arm. You didn't have to stay. Elias looked down at her hand, then at her. Neither did you. That evening, they sat by the fire again, the light casting long, quiet shadows across the floor. The danger wasn't gone, and both knew it. But the decision had been made, not by words, but by what they'd done. He had chosen to stand between her and the world that wanted her gone. She had chosen to stop running. Outside, the last light of the day faded into the canyon. Inside, their silence held something new, trust. Not complete, not easy, but earned. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost tired. If they come again, we face them together. No more running. Ayoka nodded. Together. And in that simple word, their fate was sealed, not as fugitives or saviors, but as two souls who had finally found something worth staying for. Days turned into weeks after the deputy's last visit, and the desert returned to its usual silence. The canyon winds softened, the sun rose and fell in the same relentless rhythm. And for the first time since either of them could remember, life began to move at a pace that didn't hurt. The fear that once pressed between them had loosened. It didn't vanish. It simply became a shadow they learned to live with. Elias built a small garden near the cabin, turning the dry earth into something that could hold life again. He used stones to mark the borders, carried water from the nearby stream, and patched a fence that barely stood upright. Ayoka helped him, her hands steady, her movements quiet but sure. She had always known the land better than most men, and with her guidance, sprouts of green began to break through the dust. When they worked together, they rarely spoke, but the silence had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was a kind of language, one built on trust, not fear. At night, the two sat outside, watching the sky deepen to indigo. The stars came slower here, almost reluctant to appear, but when they did, they filled the horizon with a quiet, endless light. Elias smoked his old pipe, the smoke curling into the wind. Ayoka sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket she'd repaired herself. Sometimes she'd hum old songs from her tribe, soft, wordless sounds that carried into the night. Elias never asked what they meant. He didn't need to. One evening, she broke the silence. You think they'll come back? Elias took a moment before answering. Men like Collins always move on to the next hunt. They don't stay chasing ghosts. You're safe now. She nodded slowly, though part of her still didn't believe it. The habit of running was hard to unlearn. You could have left me, Elias. Anytime. Why didn't you? He stared into the fire. Because I was tired of watching the world break people and doing nothing about it. I've done enough of that. She looked at him, studying his worn face, the deep lines carved by sun and memory. You think we can stay here? His gaze lifted toward the canyon. We've already stayed longer than I ever thought possible. As spring edged into the desert, subtle, almost invisible, their days settled into something that resembled a life. Ayoka rebuilt a small medicine table inside the cabin, using herbs, roots, and oil she traded for with travelers passing along the northern trail. Word spread quietly among drifters and nearby settlers. A woman at Redwater Canyon who could set bones, cure fevers, and treat snake bites better than any doctor in town. Elias didn't like the attention, but he saw what it did for her, how the work steadied her, how helping others gave her purpose again. One morning, a family arrived at the edge of their land. An old farmer, his wife, and a boy with a swollen leg from a riding accident. Ayoka treated the child while Elias stood by the door, rifle resting against the wall. The farmer offered money, but she refused, saying only, just tell him to stay off the horse until he can walk straight again. When they left, she turned to find Elias watching her, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen. You're building something here, he said quietly. She smiled faintly. You too. For the first time in years, his cabin felt like a home again. Tools where they belonged, fresh bread on the table, the faint scent of dried herbs mixing with smoke. The old ghost that haunted Elias, the fire, the war, the loss, began to fade. Not gone, but quieter. He found himself speaking more, even laughing sometimes. Ayoka, once withdrawn and wary, began to hum again in the mornings, her voice steady and alive. One late afternoon, they walked to the canyon's edge, the same place where she had once planned to end her life. The light was sharp and clear, the air dry but calm. Elias stood beside her, his hands resting on his belt, eyes following the horizon. "It's strange," she said quietly. "I used to look down there and see nothing but an end." He looked at her, the wind moving gently through his hair. "What do you see now?" She thought for a moment. "A place that waited long enough to give me a second chance." He smiled faintly. "Reckon it waited for both of us." They stood there in silence, the canyon stretching endlessly below them. For the first time, she didn't feel the pull of the edge. She felt grounded, rooted in something stronger than fear or memory. Later that evening, they sat by the fire again. Elias leaned back in his chair, his voice low. "You ever think about going back to your people?" She shook her head. "There's no place for me there anymore. I belong here now." He nodded. "Then you'll stay." "I will," she said, "but not because I have nowhere else to go. Because I choose to." The words lingered between them. Elias reached out and placed his weathered hand over hers. It wasn't a grand gesture, just quiet truth. Two lives that had drifted for too long, finding steady ground. When morning came, the desert was calm, washed clean by a faint night rain. The air smelled of wet stone and wild sage. Ayoka stood outside the cabin, looking toward the canyon where her old life had almost ended. Elias joined her, coffee cup in hand, his voice soft. "You picked a fine place to live after all." She smiled. "You too." The camera would pull back here if this were a film. The two figures standing side by side at the rim of Redwater Canyon, sunlight spreading across the land. The house behind them, small but standing, smoke rising gently from its chimney. The silence between them no longer heavy, but full of life. There are no more questions left to answer. No debts, no ghosts, no running. Just the simple act of staying. Proof that even in a world built on loss and dust, two broken people could still choose peace over sorrow. And for the first time, Ayoka understood survival had never been her punishment. It was her redemption.